The church smelled of wax and wilted lilies, that strange mix of grief and ceremony that clings to the air during funerals. I remember my knees trembling as I stood beside the casket of my husband, the man I had shared 4 decades of my life with. Outside, rain fell against the stained glass windows, steady and merciless, a reminder that even the sky seemed to mourn. People spoke in hushed tones, the pastor's voice droned with prayers, and I tried to focus on the memory of his laughter, the way his hands used to steady me whenever the world felt heavy. But in that sacred silence, when grief should have been the only language spoken, I heard something else. Words that cut sharper than any blade words I was never meant to understand. They whispered in Russian. My own son, the boy I had raised from cradle to manhood, leaned close to his wife. Their voices were low, but I heard them as clearly as if they had shouted across the pews. "She looks pathetic," my daughter-in-law said, her lips curling in disdain. An old cow still clinging to dignity. And my son, my flesh and blood, replied with a coldness that froze me from the inside out. "Don't worry, once this is over, we'll make her sign everything. If not, we'll have her declared incompetent. She won't see it coming. They thought they were safe. They thought their language was a shield. They thought their cruelty was hidden. But I understood every syllable. Because long before I ever became a wife, long before I ever became a mother, I had spent years in Moscow teaching English and learning the cadence of Russian like it was a second heartbeat. And there at my husband's funeral, my own children tried to bury, not just him, but me too. I wanted to scream to confront them, to shatter the mask of mourning they wore for the crowd. But my throat closed as if grief itself was holding me back. My fingers gripped the rosary so hard I felt the beads dig into my skin. Their voices lingered soft as poison. They spoke of selling the house, of splitting money that wasn't theirs, of making sure I would be taken care of in a retirement home. Taken care of. That phrase in Russian was drenched in mockery. They weren't planning to take care of me. They were planning to erase me. And there I stood, a widow draped in black, forced to listen to betrayal echo through the walls of God's house. I tell you this now, not because it is easy to relive, but because silence has always been the weapon of those who betray. If you stay silent, they win. If you lower your head, they tighten the rope. That night in the church, I realized something terrifying. Grief does not protect you from betrayal. It invites it. When you are weakest, when tears blind your eyes, that is when the knives come out. Have you ever been in that place? Have you ever felt the ground pulled out from beneath your feet, not by strangers, but by those whose blood runs in your veins? If it were you standing in black beside the man you loved, and you heard your own son plotting to rob you of everything, what would you do? Would you collapse and let them write the story of your life? Or would you stand broken, yet unyielding, and fight back? I remember staring at the casket, at the polished wood that was supposed to hold the body of my husband, and whispering to myself in Russian words only he and I would have understood. They think I am blind, but I see. The irony was sharp enough to make me choke back tears. For years, I had hidden my knowledge of that language, using it only to translate letters, to teach students to quietly remember the life I had before. Now it became my lifeline, the thread that tied me to the truth. They didn't know that I knew. They didn't know that every insult, every scheme, every filthy plan they breathed into that sacred air was being carved into my memory, word for word. I would carry it with me, and I would use it. The mourners stood and bowed their heads. The pastor prayed for eternal peace. I prayed for strength. The rain outside turned to a storm, thunder shaking the windows, as if God himself raged at the lies unfolding in his house. My son placed a hand on my shoulder, feigning tenderness, and asked in English, "Are you all right, Mama?" His eyes looked soft, his lips curved in a mask of sorrow. But I had just heard him promise to lock me away, to strip me of my dignity. That hand on my shoulder felt like a snake coiling, waiting to squeeze. I wanted to slap it away, to shout the truth. Instead, I forced a smile, a broken one, and whispered back, "I am fine." But inside, I was already preparing for war. Do you see the cruelty? Do you understand the depth of betrayal? A funeral is supposed to be the last place where secrets live. It is supposed to be sacred, untouchable, the final chapter of a life. And yet, while I mourned my husband, while I tried to remember his love, my family plotted my erasure. That day, grief and rage became twins inside me, and I knew my story was no longer about loss. It was about survival. It was about dignity. It was about whether truth could still breathe in a house filled with lies. So I ask you, as you listen to my voice now, what would you have done? Would you have let their whispers slide past like smoke, or would you have clutched them like weapons, waiting for the right moment to strike back? Comment 1 if you believe dignity is never negotiable, even in grief. Hit like if you know betrayal always drags its shadow into the light. Because this story is not just about me. It is about every widow who has ever been silenced, every mother who has ever been mocked, every soul who has ever been told that their time was over. They thought I would go quietly, but they were wrong. Long before the funeral, before the storm of betrayal revealed its full force, there had already been whispers in the air shadows at the edge of my vision. I remember the first time I felt something fracture between us, though at the moment I told myself it was only stress, only the fatigue of caring for a dying man. My husband had always managed our papers with meticulous care. He was the sort of man who kept receipts from 30 years ago, neatly filed in boxes labeled by month and year, the kind who never missed a payment, never misplaced a certificate. So when I went to his desk one quiet afternoon and found the drawers strangely empty, my heart hesitated. Important documents, insurance forms, even the property deed things that should have been stacked where he always kept them were gone. I told myself perhaps he had moved them. Perhaps one of the children had simply borrowed them. But even then, a strange chill brushed down my spine. I asked my son about it that evening. He was sitting at the kitchen table, tapping impatiently at his phone, the glow of the screen lighting his face. "Did you see the papers from your father's desk?" I asked, gently. He looked up too quickly, his smile strained. "Yes, Mama, don't worry. I'm just organizing everything. You don't need to trouble yourself with all those details. Trouble myself." That phrase lingered. It wasn't his tone that unsettled me, but the fact that he had said it in English with that careful precision he always used when he was trying to end a conversation before it began. My son had once run to me with every scraped knee, every school report card begging for my attention. Now he dismissed me like a child too fragile to hold her own life in her hands. That night I could not sleep. I lay awake listening to my husband's labored breathing, each rasp a reminder of how little time we had left together. My mind kept circling the missing documents, the way my son's eyes had shifted, the clipped way he had said, "Don't worry." The irony was cruel. He had always been the one I worried most about, the one I had defended, even when his mistakes were obvious. Now he wanted me not to worry, as though I were too old, too fragile, too irrelevant to have a say in what would happen when my husband was gone. A week later, my daughter-in-law came to the house. She carried herself like a queen descending into a peasant's cottage, her perfume cloying her voice bright with false sweetness. She brought soup, claiming it was a family recipe, though I could taste the bitterness in every spoonful. When my husband fell asleep, she turned to me with a smile that did not touch her eyes. "You must be tired," she said. "All this responsibility, the house, the bills, it's too much for one woman alone." I nodded politely, though inside I bristled. When the time comes, she continued, her fingers tapping lightly on the table. "We'll help you. We'll make sure everything is in order. You won't have to worry about a single thing." Her words echoed the same pattern as my son's. "Don't worry. You won't have to trouble yourself." It was as if they were rehearsing from the same script, a script I had not been given. After she left, I went to my husband's bedside and whispered, "Something is wrong. They are planning something." He stirred his eyelids, fluttering, but he was too weak to answer. I pressed his hand and felt the faintest squeeze, as though even in his silence he was trying to warn me, "Be careful." The first tangible proof arrived one rainy afternoon when the mailman slipped an envelope through the slot. It was addressed not to my husband, not even to me, but to my son. Curious, I opened it. Inside was a letter from an insurance company thanking him for updating the beneficiary information. My stomach clenched as I read the words. It stated that in the event of my husband's passing, certain accounts would be transferred directly to my son's management for the care of his dependent mother. Dependent. That word seared into my brain like a brand. I was not dependent. I had spent my life working, cooking, cleaning, raising, sacrificing. I had built the foundation of everything they now stood upon. But there it was, in black and white, my son had positioned himself not as my child, but as my caretaker, my legal guardian in all but name. When he came by that evening, I placed the letter on the table between us. His face drained of color, then quickly flushed red. "You shouldn't have opened that, Mama," he snapped. For the first time, he spoke to me, not as a son to a mother, but as a man scolding an inconvenience. "This is for your own good. You won't have to deal with paperwork or finances anymore." I looked into his eyes and asked, "And what about my wishes? Do they matter?" He looked away, fiddling with his phone. "You'll be taken care of," he muttered. "That's what matters." But his tone betrayed him. It wasn't care. It was control. That night, I sat in the dark, the letter trembling in my hands. I remembered Moscow decades ago, when I was young and fearless, when I had walked through snow-lined streets with nothing but determination to carve out a life in a foreign land. I had faced loneliness, hunger, even fear, but never had I felt as powerless as I did, holding that letter. It was as though my life had been rewritten without my consent, my future decided in whispers and signatures, forged behind my back. The next morning, I returned to my husband's desk, searching desperately for anything he might have hidden. At first, I found nothing but dust and scattered pens. But then, beneath the false bottom of a drawer, my fingers brushed against something rough. I pulled it out, an old notebook, its cover worn, its pages filled with his familiar handwriting. My heart ached as I read his words, written in uneven lines during his final months. "Charles insists I sign more papers," one entry said. "He says it's for Margot's safety, but I feel uneasy. Why so much hurry? Why so much secrecy?" Another page read, "They want me to change the will. I cannot bring myself to do it. I fear what will happen after I'm gone." The ink was smudged in places as if his trembling hand had struggled to hold the pen. Yet every word was a lifeline proof that I was not imagining things. He had seen the darkness too. He had tried to warn me. I closed the notebook and pressed it to my chest, tears streaming down my face. My husband had trusted me with his fears, and now it was up to me to face them. But how I was alone in that house, surrounded by vultures disguised as family. Still in that moment, something inside me hardened. If they thought I would be silent, they were mistaken. If they thought I would simply fade into the background, they had underestimated me. I had survived worse. I would survive this too. But even that determination wavered when I discovered the forgery. It was late at night, the house silent except for the ticking of the old clock. I had gone through another pile of papers, desperate to understand what else they had changed. And there, beneath a stack of utility bills, I found it the deed to our home, with my husband's signature at the bottom. At first glance, it looked real, but I knew his handwriting as well as my own. The curves were too sharp, the lines too heavy. It was not his hand. It was an imitation, sloppy but confident enough to pass if no one looked too closely. And next to it was my own name, my own signature, except I had never signed it. They had forged me too. I remember sinking into the chair, the paper crumpling in my fists, my body shaking. Betrayal was no longer a suspicion. It was a fact stamped in ink, written in lies. My son, my own son, had stolen not just his father's trust, but mine too. He had erased me from my own life, tried to bind me in chains made of paper. I stared at the forged signature, the mockery of my name, and whispered through clenched teeth, "You will not win." The days after the funeral blurred into a haze of condolences and casseroles, people coming and going, voices murmuring hollow sympathies that never touched the wound in my chest. I moved through the house like a shadow, haunted by the whispers I had overheard and the forged signatures I had discovered. Every corner of the house felt contaminated. Every piece of furniture carried the weight of betrayal. And yet in the midst of that suffocating darkness, a familiar face appeared. One I had not expected, one that reminded me of who I had once been before motherhood, before grief, before everything had narrowed to survival. Her name was Elena, a friend from my years in Moscow. She had been my neighbor back then, a fellow teacher who shared her bread with me when I was too poor to afford dinner, who had taught me idioms and laughter when the city felt unbearably cold. I hadn't seen her in more than 20 years, but when she walked through the door that afternoon, her eyes filled with compassion, I felt something break open in me. For the first time since my husband's death, I let myself fall into someone's arms. She held me as I wept, her voice whispering in Russian, "You are not alone, Margot. You are not alone." We sat in the kitchen, steam rising from cups of tea, and I told her pieces of what had happened, careful not to reveal everything just yet. She listened with that quiet attentiveness that had always been her gift, her eyes narrowing only when I mentioned my son and daughter-in-law's eagerness to manage the estate. She tilted her head, her voice soft. "Be careful. When people speak of care too much, it is usually control they want." Her words pierced me because they echoed the very thought I had been afraid to say aloud. Later that evening, as rain tapped against the windows, Elena helped me tidy the living room. We were sorting through condolence cards when the front door creaked open. My son and his wife stepped in, their expressions carefully arranged into masks of solemnity. They greeted Elena politely, though I saw a flicker of unease when she responded in fluent Russian. An old friend from Moscow, I explained, my tone deliberately casual. My son forced a smile, but I saw his jaw tighten. He excused himself to take a call in the study, his wife trailing after him. Elena and I continued picking up dishes, but then she froze, her eyes darting toward the hall. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. At first I thought it was only the rain, but then the voices filtered through the thin walls. Russian, quick and sharp, the syllables like knives slicing the air. I crept closer with Elena at my side, holding my breath. My daughter-in-law's voice came first, dripping with venom. "She looks weaker every day. We just have to hold on a little longer. The lawyer will side with us once we prove she's unstable." Then my son's reply, cold, deliberate. "The forged signatures are ready. The bank thinks it's already done. She won't know what hit her. And if she resists, we'll get that medical report. Dementia, depression, something. We'll find a doctor willing to sign." Their words struck me like blows, each syllable confirming that the nightmare was not in my head. It was real, and it was growing. Elena's hand gripped mine, her knuckles white. Her lips formed the words, silently. "They are planning to destroy you." I wanted to burst into the room, to scream, to slap the masks off their faces. But Elena pulled me back, shaking her head. "Not now, not without proof." So we stood there in the dim hallway, two women listening to the casual cruelty of a son toward his own mother. My stomach twisted as I heard my daughter-in-law laugh, a sound so cold it could have frozen fire. "She'll sign whatever we put in front of her." She always looks so confused these days. One glass of wine too many, one slip of the tongue, and no one will doubt she's losing her mind. I stumbled back, pressing my hand to my mouth to keep from crying out. Confused. Losing my mind. They were weaving the net, already pulling the strings tighter with every sentence. I remembered every sharp look, every dismissive comment in the weeks before my husband's death. They had been building this narrative for months, perhaps even years, setting the stage to cast me as a burden, as a senile old woman, unfit to guard her own life. My husband had seen it coming. His journal entries had been warnings, and I had brushed them aside as paranoia. Now I realized he had been right all along. When the voices quieted and they returned, Elena and I were back in the living room pretending to fuss with teacups. My son looked at me with feigned concern, his voice too gentle, too rehearsed. "Mama, you should get some rest. You look tired." I forced a smile, my heart pounding, and nodded. But inside, I was raging. Tired, yes. Weary with grief, yes. But not weak, not confused, and certainly not incapable of understanding the venom dripping from their tongues. That night after they left, Elena sat across from me at the kitchen table, her eyes steady, her voice low. "Margot, you cannot let this continue. They are not just greedy, they are ruthless. They will not stop until you are erased." Her words settled like stones in my stomach. I wanted to argue, to cling to the hope that maybe my son had been coerced. Maybe he still loved me beneath the coldness. But the evidence was too heavy. His own voice, speaking in the language we both loved, had damned him. He was not a prisoner of her ambition. He was a partner in it. Elena reached across the table and clasped my hands. "You have the language. You have the memory. Use it. Record them. Document everything. And when the time comes, expose them." I shook my head, fear prickling my skin. "They'll call me paranoid. They'll twist everything. They already have the documents, the lawyer, maybe even doctors ready to lie." Elena's eyes burned with fire. "Then you must find allies who will not be fooled, and you must trust your own strength. You are not a helpless widow, Margot. You are a woman who has survived snowstorms in Moscow, who has built a family from nothing, who has carried love and loss across decades. Don't let them strip you of that." Her words struck something inside me that I thought had died with my husband. For the first time since his passing, I felt a flicker of defiance. They thought I would crumble under the weight of grief. They thought I would be too blind to see, too fragile to resist. But they had forgotten who raised them, who taught them to stand, who sacrificed everything so they could climb. They had forgotten that I, too, had teeth. Still, fear haunted me. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I heard my son's voice echoing in my mind. "She won't know what hit her." Over and over, the words replayed like a curse. I wanted to believe Elena's faith in me, but part of me still trembled. What if they succeeded? What if I ended my days not in my home, surrounded by memories of my husband, but in a sterile room, labeled incompetent, silenced forever? My eyes burned with tears, but beneath them, anger pulsed like a heartbeat. They wanted to erase me. I would not let them. The next morning, Elena packed her bag, but before leaving, she embraced me tightly. "Be strong, watch carefully, and remember, you are not crazy. You are not alone. I will return when you need me." Her departure left the house quieter, but also steadier. She had handed me a weapon not in the form of steel or paper, but in the reminder of who I was. And as the door closed behind her, I whispered to myself in Russian this time, so the walls themselves would carry it, "I see you, and I will not forget." But even as those words left my lips, I knew the storm was only just beginning. Grief is a strange companion. It dulls some things and sharpens others. In the weeks after the funeral, I found myself walking through the house like a stranger, each room echoing with memories I could almost touch. The kitchen smelled of his coffee, the study still carried the faint trace of his cologne, and our bedroom was unbearably empty. Yet beneath all the sorrow, my senses had never been more awake. Every word, every glance, every silence from my son and his wife felt like signals in a coded language only I could understand. They thought they were clever, but their cruelty seeped through the cracks. The isolation began subtly, almost tenderly disguised. My son called more often, his tone dripping with concern. "Mama, are you eating well? "You sound forgetful. Did you take your medicine?" At first I thought it was kindness, but soon I realized he was weaving a story for anyone who might be listening. Forgetful, fragile, confused, words that planted seeds of doubt. I snapped once, telling him sharply that my mind was perfectly fine, that I remembered every detail of the last 30 years. He chuckled softly as though humoring a child. "Of course, Mama, but maybe you should write things down just to be safe." That laugh, so patronizing, made my blood burn. My daughter-in-law was worse. She stopped pretending to like me. Her smiles became thin, her words sharp beneath the sugar. She would move things around the house, a vase here, a book there, then later ask why I hadn't noticed. "Are you sure you don't misplace things?" she'd say, her eyes wide with mock innocence. Once she put the kettle on without water and let it scorch the stove, then shook her head when I panicked at the smoke. "You must have forgotten to fill it, poor thing." Her voice was syrupy, but her eyes gleamed with triumph. They were staging scenes, crafting a play in which I was the senile widow, too far gone to trust with her own home. The family dinner was the worst. They invited relatives, cousins I hadn't seen in years, neighbors who came to pay their respects. The dining room was lit with candles, the table crowded with dishes my daughter-in-law claimed she had prepared herself. I knew the recipes were mine, stolen from the notebooks in my kitchen drawer. Still, I said nothing. I sat at the head of the table, the chair that had always belonged to my husband, and tried to summon dignity. But soon the conversation turned. Subtle at first, then sharper. "Margot, do you remember what day it is?" someone asked with a smirk. When I answered correctly, my daughter-in-law leaned forward. Impressive. She usually forgets these things. Laughter rippled down the table. My cheeks burned. Then my son raised his glass. To my mother, he said, his voice solemn, but his words poisoned. "To the woman who gave us everything, even if she doesn't always remember it." The guests chuckled uneasily, not sure whether it was a joke or a barb. I felt the room tilt, the air tighten. In that moment, I was not a mother, not a widow, not a woman of flesh and blood. I was a caricature, a puppet in their cruel performance. My heart pounded with rage, but my mouth stayed closed. If I shouted, they would call it hysteria. If I cried, they would call it weakness. So I swallowed the humiliation like bitter wine and stared into the candlelight, silently vowing that I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. Later that night, after the guests had gone, I found myself alone in the darkened dining room. The candles had burned low, their wax spilling like blood onto the silver candlesticks. I touched the back of my husband's chair and whispered, "They're trying to erase me." For a moment, I thought I heard his voice in the silence telling me to fight to endure. But then the front door creaked open and I realized I was not alone. My daughter-in-law's voice drifted from the hall, mocking cruel. "She's slipping faster than I thought. Did you see how confused she looked? By Christmas, everyone will believe she's incompetent." My son's laughter followed, sharp and hollow. "Good. The sooner the better. Once the papers are signed, she'll have no say. And if she resists, we'll prove she's unfit. We'll have her committed if we must." Their footsteps faded upstairs, but the words stayed carved into my bones. I sat in the dark, trembling, my hands gripping the edge of the table. My mind screamed at me to confront them, to expose them, to tear down the lies they were spinning. But another part of me whispered patience. Without proof, my fury would be twisted into the very evidence they needed. I could almost hear the doctor's report, already paranoid delusions, emotional instability, possible dementia. If I gave them anger, they would brand it madness. So I bit my tongue until it bled, and in that silence, something inside me hardened further. They wanted to isolate me. They wanted me to doubt myself. But I would not. I would remember. I would record. I would survive. The pressure grew heavier each day. Relatives called less often, as though the whispers had already reached them. A cousin avoided my eyes when we met at the market, muttering something about how I must be struggling alone. Struggling. The word spread like a stain, soaking through every conversation. Even the pastor visited, his tone gentle, suggesting perhaps I consider moving into a smaller place for my own safety. I thanked him politely, but inside I raged. They were building a world where I was already gone, my voice drowned beneath their lies. Then the document arrived. Another envelope slipped under my door, this one thicker, heavier. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a legal notice drafted with cold precision. It stated that a petition had been filed to transfer guardianship of my affairs to my son. Guardianship. The word sent ice through my veins. It meant control of my finances, my home, even my medical decisions. It meant erasure. The petition cited increasing memory lapses and signs of cognitive decline, phrases that painted me as a shell of a woman. My eyes blurred with tears, but through them I saw the forged signatures again, the staged humiliations, the calculated whispers. It was all fitting together. They had laid the trap carefully, and now the jaws were closing. I stumbled to the bedroom, clutching the papers to my chest, my breath ragged. For a moment I thought of surrender. I was tired, so tired. Perhaps it would be easier to let them win, to let the tide wash me away. But then I thought of Elena's words. You are not helpless. You are not alone. I thought of my husband's journal, his trembling handwriting begging me to be cautious. And I thought of the rosary still on my nightstand, the beads that had dug into my hand at the funeral when I first heard their betrayal. No, I would not let them erase me. I would not let them bury me alive. I sat at the desk, pen in hand, and began to write everything I remembered, every word they had spoken in Russian, every forged document, every humiliation carefully staged. My handwriting shook, but my resolve steadied with each line. If they wanted a narrative of confusion, I would give them clarity. If they wanted to paint me as weak, I would show them strength. And if they wanted to silence me, I would make sure my voice rang louder than theirs. As I wrote, the clock ticked past midnight, each chime reminding me that time was running short. The guardianship hearing would come. The lawyer would listen to their lies, but I would be ready. I whispered again into the silence this time, not to my husband, but to myself. They think I am fading, but I am awake. I am watching. And I will not be erased. There comes a moment in every storm when the sky turns so black, you wonder if the sun will ever return. For me, that moment came one gray afternoon when the house no longer felt like home, but like a stage for my humiliation. The whispers had grown louder, the looks more pointed, the isolation complete. Neighbors who once waved now glanced away. My pastor's visits had grown stiff, as if even he had begun to believe the narrative that I was slipping into madness. Every detail of my life, every slip of memory, every moment of grief had been twisted into evidence against me. And then the papers arrived. They did not even pretend anymore. My son and his wife sat me down in the living room, a stack of documents on the coffee table between us. The curtains were drawn, shutting out the weak winter light, and the air was thick with the scent of her perfume, cloying and invasive. My son's voice was smooth, rehearsed, dripping with false concern. "Mama, these are just to help you, to make sure everything is taken care of. You don't need to worry about bills or lawyers or the house. Just sign and everything will be easier." His wife leaned forward, her smile sharp as glass. "You'll have peace of mind. Isn't that what you want, peace?" My hands trembled as I picked up the top page. Guardianship transfer, bank account management, property authorization. Each line stripped another piece of me away until I was nothing but a signature on a page, a shell of a woman to be managed, controlled, erased. My name was already there, forged on earlier drafts. All they needed was my real hand to seal the lie forever. I looked up at my son, at the boy I had once held against my chest, and I searched his eyes for mercy. All I saw was impatience. "Just sign, Mama," he urged. "You don't need to think so hard." In that moment, despair crushed me. My chest tightened, my throat burned. What if they were right? What if I was too tired, too broken to fight? What if I should just give in, surrender the weight of decisions, let them carry the burden? Even if it meant losing myself, I felt the pen heavy in my hand, the ink like poison waiting to spill. My daughter-in-law's nails tapped the table, her eyes gleaming with anticipation. For a moment, I almost signed, but then I heard his voice. Not in the room, not in my ears, but in my memory, the voice of my husband, recorded in the very marrow of my bones. Don't let them take what we built, Margot. Don't let them erase you. I could almost see him at his desk, his hands trembling as he wrote in his journal, his eyes clouded with worry. He had seen this coming. He had tried to warn me. My grip tightened around the pen, and instead of signing, I set it down slowly. My son frowned. "Mama, what's wrong? You can trust me." His wife's smile faltered, her mask slipping for just a second. I forced a smile of my own, my voice calm, though my heart thundered. "I will think about it." Their faces hardened. My son slammed his hand against the table, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "There is nothing to think about. You're not capable of handling this anymore. The longer you wait, the worse it gets. Just sign." His outburst shook me, but I refused to flinch. "Not today," I whispered, my voice steadier than I felt. His wife hissed, "You're only making this harder on yourself." They gathered the papers with sharp movements, their silence louder than any scream, and stormed out of the house. When the door slammed shut, I collapsed into the chair, my body trembling with exhaustion. That night was the darkest of all. I sat alone in the kitchen, the ticking of the clock mocking me, the house echoing with ghosts. Doubt crawled into my mind like a parasite. What if they were right? What if my refusal only proved their claims of instability? What if, in fighting, I was digging my own grave? I stared at the rosary beads on the table until my vision blurred. For the first time, I whispered into the silence, "Maybe I am weak. Maybe I am finished." The words tasted like ash, but they spilled out nonetheless. Sleep would not come. I wandered the house, touching the walls, as though to remind myself it was still mine. My steps carried me to my husband's study, the room I had avoided since his death. The air smelled of dust and old paper, a mausoleum of his careful order. I sat at his desk, running my hands over the wood, and whispered, "What do I do?" And then, as if an answer, the drawer stuck. I pulled harder, and it came loose with a groan. Inside was a small envelope yellowed with age, addressed in his handwriting. My heart lurched. I opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a letter. The ink was faded, but the words were clear. "Margot, if you are reading this, then I am gone. I fear what our son has become, what influence surrounds him. I have kept copies of everything, wills, deeds, accounts, in a safe place only you know. Remember the old box in the attic, the one we used to keep photographs in. Look beneath the false bottom. Trust no one else. And remember this, the Russian you once loved, to learn will save you now. Do not let them silence you. Your strength is greater than you know." I pressed the letter to my lips, tears spilling down my face. He had known. He had prepared. The despair that had nearly drowned me shifted into something sharper, harder. Proof existed. Documents existed. The net they had cast was not unbreakable. I wiped my eyes and whispered into the empty room, "I will not sign. I will not surrender. I will fight." But as I folded the letter back into the envelope, footsteps echoed in the hall. My blood ran cold. My son's voice called, "Mama, are you awake?" Panic surged through me. If he saw the letter, if he knew what I had, everything would be lost. I slid it beneath the desk blotter just as the door creaked open. He stood there, his eyes narrowed, scanning the room. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. His tone was casual, but his gaze was sharp, suspicious. I forced a smile, hiding my trembling hands, just remembering. He nodded slowly, his eyes lingering on the desk, then finally turned away. "Try to get some rest. You need it." The door closed, but the message was clear. He was watching. Always watching. I waited until the house was silent again, then retrieved the letter, pressing it to my chest like a shield. Upstairs in the attic, dust swirled in the beam of my flashlight. I dragged the old photo box from beneath a stack of blankets, my hands trembling as I pried open the false bottom. Inside lay a bundle of papers neatly tied with twine, just as he had promised. Deeds, bank records. The original will naming me sole heir. Tears blurred my vision as I realized the truth. He had protected me even in death. He had armed me with the very weapons I needed. For the first time in weeks, I felt something close to hope. The storm had not ended, but now I had an anchor. They thought they had me cornered, ready to sign away my life. But they had underestimated both of us, my husband's foresight and my refusal to be erased. I closed the box, whispering in Russian, "You will not win. Not now. Not ever." Yet, even with the proof in my hands, I knew the battle was far from over. They would not stop. They would push harder, strike, faster, rage louder. And when they did, I would be ready. The night ended with me sitting on the attic floor, the bundle of papers in my lap, my husband's letter against my heart. Outside, the storm howled, but inside, for the first time, I was no longer drowning. I was waiting. Hope is a fragile thing. It does not arrive with a trumpet or a banner. It comes quietly in the form of a letter hidden in a drawer in the rustle of papers, preserved by a dying man who foresaw the storm his wife would have to endure alone. When I found my husband's message and the documents he had safeguarded, I felt something shift deep inside me. For weeks I had been drowning, pulled under by grief and betrayal. But now, clutching those papers in my hands, I remembered who I was. I was not the helpless widow they wanted me to be. I was not the confused old woman they described to lawyers and neighbors. I was Margot, who had once walked the streets of Moscow alone, who had once learned a foreign tongue until it sang in her blood, who had once built a family from nothing but will and love. They thought they had cornered me, but they had underestimated how dangerous a cornered woman can become. From that night forward, I was no longer just surviving. I was planning. I began to carry a small recorder, one my husband had used years ago to dictate letters for work. It fit easily into my pocket, its light blinking softly like a secret heartbeat. Whenever my son and his wife came to the house, I turned it on. Their voices, so careful in English, loosened in Russian where they thought themselves safe. I captured every word. Their insults, their schemes, their plans to declare me unfit, all of it now preserved in cold, undeniable sound. Each recording felt like another stone in the wall. I was building a fortress against their lies. At first, the act of recording terrified me. My hands would sweat, my heart would pound, afraid they might notice the faint click or the glimmer of light. But soon I realized how careless they had become. Their arrogance was a shield blinding them. They believed so completely in their performance of concern that they never imagined I might be watching, listening, preparing. One afternoon, while pouring tea in the kitchen, I captured my daughter-in-law whispering, "Once she's declared incompetent, the house is ours. I'll redecorate everything. No more of her dreary curtains." My son chuckled in response, his voice casual. "By then she'll be locked away and we won't have to deal with her moods. Just patience, my love. Patience and signatures." I stirred sugar into my cup with steady hands, even as rage boiled inside me. They had no idea that their own voices were digging their graves. But recordings were not enough. I needed allies. Elena had been right. Proof must be paired with witnesses. So I began to reach out quietly, carefully. I spoke with the neighbor who had seen my daughter-in-law moving appraisers through the yard before the funeral, and I asked if he would testify if needed. His eyes widened, but he nodded firmly. "Of course, Margot. I knew something was off. I visited the pastor not to confess weakness, but to plant doubt about the lies. I told him stories of my years in Russia, reciting proverbs in fluent Russian until his eyebrows rose in surprise. I had no idea, he said softly. You sound strong. That was the point. I was reshaping the narrative, weaving my own threads into the fabric they had tried to suffocate me with. Every night I studied the papers my husband had hidden, memorizing the dates, the signatures, the clauses that prove my rightful place. I organized them into folders labeled in both English and Russian, knowing that clarity was my greatest weapon. If they tried to drown me in accusations of confusion, I would answer with order, so precise it would shame them. My husband's foresight was my compass, guiding me step by step through the labyrinth. The Russian you once loved to learn will save you now, he had written. Those words burned in my mind. And so when I listened to the recordings, I began to translate them line by line into English transcripts. Every insult, every plan to commit me, I rendered into words that no judge, no lawyer, no relative could deny. Their own tongues would betray them. Their own arrogance would destroy them. The change did not go unnoticed. My son looked at me with suspicion one afternoon, tilting his head as though seeing me for the first time in months. You seem different, Mama, he said slowly, more alert. His wife smirked, adding, It must be one of her good days. I smiled softly, meeting his gaze. Perhaps it is, I said, my voice calm steady. Inside, I was laughing bitterly. If only they knew how much I had already gathered, how close the trap was to snapping shut. Their eyes still saw me as weak, but my spine had hardened into steel. Still fear lingered. There were nights I lay awake, the recorder clutched to my chest, imagining what would happen if they discovered it. What would they do if they found out I had evidence? Would they act faster? More ruthlessly, I prayed for strength. Prayed that I could hold my mask of weakness long enough for the truth to solidify. And slowly the mask became easier to wear. When they mocked me, I let my gaze wander, feigning confusion, while my recorder hummed in my pocket. When they whispered in Russian, I bit my lip to keep from smiling. Every word was fuel. Every insult was proof. They thought they were breaking me. But really, they were handing me the very weapons I needed. The first small victory came one evening when the lawyer visited to review the guardianship petition. My son and his wife sat beside him, their voices dripping with practiced sorrow. She forgets things, my son said gravely. She can't manage bills. She gets confused. The lawyer adjusted his glasses, glancing at me with pity. But before I could speak, my neighbor, Joseph, cleared his throat. He had come to deliver flowers, but I had asked him to stay. Forgive me. Joseph said, his voice steady, but I've never once seen Margot confused. In fact, she speaks Russian fluently. Just last week she translated for a tourist who was lost in town. Remarkable memory, if you ask me. The lawyer's pen hesitated above the page. My son's jaw tightened. His wife's eyes flashed with anger. I sipped my tea quietly, hiding the smile that tugged at my lips. It was a small crack, but a crack nonetheless. The mask they had built around me was beginning to slip. That night when the house was quiet, I played the recording of their whispers again, listening to their laughter about committing me, about redecorating my house after I was gone. I closed my eyes, feeling the fury rise like fire, and then I whispered into the dark, not yet. Soon. Because the time for silence was ending. The time for confrontation was near. So, now I ask you the ones, listening to my story, what would you have done in my place? Would you have signed those papers, surrendered your life to the people who called you pathetic behind your back? Or would you have bided your time, gathered your weapons, and waited for the right moment to strike comment 1, if you believe patience can be sharper than rage? Hit like if you know betrayal always carries the seeds of its own destruction. They thought they were burying me. What they didn't know was that I was planting roots, and soon those roots would break the ground wide open. It happened on a night when the air itself felt heavy with secrets. The storm outside rattled the shutters, wind howling like a warning, but inside the house, the silence was worse. My son had come alone. No wife beside him this time, no false smiles to soften the edges. He walked into the living room with papers in his hand, his eyes sharp and restless. "Mama," he began, his voice low, "this has gone on long enough. You're making things harder for everyone. We need to finalize this, tonight." I sat in my chair, my husband's rosary in my lap, the recorder hidden in my pocket, blinking like a quiet ally. For weeks I had played the role of the weak widow, nodding and trembling, letting them believe I was fading. But tonight, I was done with masks. Tonight, the storm would break. He tossed the papers onto the table, guardianship forms again, the same cold words demanding my life in signatures. "Just sign, Mama," he said, leaning close. His face, the face I had once kissed goodnight, now looked like a stranger's, hard and hungry. No more delays. His hand pushed the pen toward me, his impatience raw. I looked at him for a long moment, my heart thundering. Then I said, in Russian, slowly, clearly, "Ты думаешь, что я глупая? Ты думаешь, что я ничего не понимаю? Do you think I am stupid? Do you think I understand nothing?" The change in his face was instant. His eyes widened, his mouth opened, but no sound came. The words struck him harder than any slap. He staggered back a step, blinking his composure, shattering. For the first time, he realized the truth. Every whisper, every insult, every scheme he had muttered in Russian had not been secret at all. I had understood. I had always understood. I rose from my chair, my body trembling, not with weakness, but with fury. "I heard you." I continued in Russian, my voice rising, years of silence cracking apart. Every word at the funeral, every word in this house. You plotted to erase me in the language you thought I could not understand. You called me pathetic. You promised to lock me away. You planned to steal everything your father and I built with our hands. My words echoed through the room, sharp and merciless. He tried to speak, stammering, "Mama." It's not," but I cut him off with a look that froze him in place. "Do not lie to me," I said, switching back to English, my voice iron. "I have your words. I have them recorded. The world will hear the truth if I choose to release it. Every insult, every betrayal. Do you understand what that means?" His face paled, sweat beading on his forehead. The pen on the table lay untouched, a useless weapon now that the ground beneath him had shifted. For the first time in months, I saw fear in his eyes. Not the fear of a child being scolded, but the fear of a man caught a predator, realizing his prey had teeth after all. He whispered, almost pleading, "Mama, you don't know what you're doing. You'll ruin everything." I stepped closer, the rosary still in my hand, my eyes locked on his. "No," I said coldly. "You ruined everything the moment you stood at your father's funeral and chose greed over love." The storm outside cracked with thunder, shaking the windows, as though the heavens themselves punctuated my words. He flinched his shoulders, sagging, the mask of control slipping away. For a moment, he looked like the boy I had once raised, vulnerable, lost. But then his jaw clenched, anger flickering in his eyes. "You wouldn't dare," he hissed. "You wouldn't expose your own son." I leaned in close, my voice a whisper sharp as glass. "Try me." The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. He stared at me, searching for weakness, but I gave him none. At last he turned away, gathering the papers with shaking hands. "This isn't over," he muttered. His footsteps echoed down the hall, the door slamming behind him like a gunshot. I stood alone in the quiet, my chest heaving the storm outside, raging in harmony with the storm inside me. For weeks I had been the hunted. Tonight I became the hunter. The day of the meeting arrived heavy with tension, the kind of day where even the air feels staged, waiting for a performance. The lawyer had summoned us to his office, a tall building with glass walls that reflected the gray sky. My son and his wife walked ahead of me, their heads held high, their hands clasped tightly together like victors about to claim their prize. I followed slowly each step, deliberate, the weight of my husband's hidden documents in my bag, the recorder secure in my pocket. For weeks they had thought me weak, fragile, defeated. Today they would learn otherwise. The conference room smelled of leather and ink, the walls lined with books that seemed to watch silently. The lawyer sat at the head of the long table, his glasses perched on his nose, a stack of papers before him. My son slid into the seat beside him, his wife across from me, her smile sharp and triumphant. "We appreciate you meeting us, my son," began his voice, smooth, rehearsed. "It's time we address the guardianship petition. My mother, well, she's struggling. We want to make sure she's cared for properly." His wife nodded, her tone syrupy. "We've seen signs, confusion, forgetfulness, emotional instability. We can't stand by and watch her suffer." The lawyer glanced at me, his eyes tinged with pity, then back at them. "I understand your concerns. But before we proceed, Mrs. Ivanov, do you have anything you'd like to say?" I folded my hands on the table, my heart pounding like a drum. For a moment, I let the silence hang, the tension stretch, until even their smiles wavered. Then I spoke, my voice steady. "Yes, I do." I reached into my bag and set a small device on the table. My son's face drained of color the moment he saw it. His wife shifted in her seat, her eyes narrowing. The lawyer looked confused. "What is this?" he asked. I pressed the button, and the room filled with voices. My son's voice, my daughter-in-law's voice, cold, cruel, unmistakable. "Once she's declared incompetent, the house is ours. She'll sign whatever we put in front of her. One slip of the tongue and no one will doubt she's losing her mind." Their laughter followed, echoing off the polished wood of the table. The lawyer's eyebrows shot up. He glanced at them, then at me. My son stammered. That's taken out of context. You don't understand." His wife tried to laugh it off, but her voice trembled. "Anyone can record anything these days. It doesn't prove I cut her off my eyes blazing. It proves everything. Because I understood every word. You thought you were safe speaking in Russian. You thought your language was your weapon, but it was your undoing. I lived in Moscow. I taught that language. I understood every syllable." Gasps rippled from the assistants in the room who had been silently taking notes. My son's face twisted, half fury, half fear. "Mama, you don't know what you're doing," he hissed, but his voice had lost its authority. I reached back into my bag and placed another folder on the table. "And if that isn't enough, here are the original documents your father hid. The real will, the real deeds. Every signature authentic, preserved. He knew what you would try to do. He prepared for this moment. He trusted me to protect what we built." The lawyer flipped through the papers, his eyes widening as he scanned the signatures, the notarized seals, the unmistakable handwriting of my late husband. He looked up slowly, his voice quiet but firm. "These override any claims made in the petition. The property remains under Mrs. Ivanov's sole ownership. The accounts as well." He set the papers down, his gaze hardening on my son. "And this recording..." He shook his head, disbelief mingling with disappointment. "It paints a very different picture than the one you've tried to present." My daughter-in-law's mask shattered. Her face twisted with rage, her voice rising shrill. "This is ridiculous. She's manipulating you. She's old. She's senile." Her words faltered when I fixed her with a gaze that had once silenced classrooms of unruly students. I spoke softly, but the words cut sharper than any scream. "Senile." Then how do I stand here today with your own words in my hands? How do I recite them back in Russian, word for word? And I did. In front of everyone, I repeated their insults, their schemes, their laughter, each word in flawless Russian, each syllable a blade. The lawyer's staff stared, stunned. There was no denying it now. My son slumped in his chair, his face pale, his hands shaking. For a brief moment, I saw the boy he once was, lost, ashamed. But pity could not erase what he had done. My voice hardened. "At your father's funeral, you chose greed over love. You betrayed not only me, but his memory. And now everyone knows." The lawyer closed the folder with a decisive snap. "The petition is dismissed. Further action may be required given the forgery and the intent suggested in these recordings. I advise you both to prepare for legal consequences." His words landed like a gavel, final and merciless. My daughter-in-law gasped, her face flushing scarlet. My son whispered something under his breath, his shoulders hunched as though the weight of his choices had finally crushed him. I stood gathering the papers and the recorder, my hands steady at last. "This is over," I said quietly. "You tried to erase me, but the truth is louder than your lies." The storm outside had broken into rain, tapping gently against the glass as if the heavens themselves had exhaled. As I walked out of the office, the weight I carried was no longer grief, but something fiercer: dignity reclaimed, justice won. For months they had buried me in silence, in whispers, in forged papers. Today I rose. The thing about truth is that once it escapes, it does not whisper, it roars. What began in the lawyer's office did not stay confined within those four walls. The assistants, who had sat silently with pens in hand, left the meeting with eyes wide and mouths tight, and by nightfall half the town seemed to know. The whispers that had once painted me as frail and senile now shifted, curdling into pity for me and scorn for my son and his wife. For so long they had tried to make me invisible. Now they were the ones who shrank under every glance. The first to come was Joseph, my neighbor of many years. He knocked gently on my door that evening, carrying a pie his wife had baked. His eyes, once filled with hesitation, whenever he saw my son around, now burned with quiet fury. "I knew something was wrong," he said softly. "I heard them in your yard months ago with that appraiser. I didn't want to interfere. I thought, maybe it wasn't my place. But now I see it should have been. If you need me to testify, I will." No hesitation. I clasped his hand, gratitude warming the cracks grief had left in me. For weeks I had felt abandoned, doubted, silenced. Now one by one voices were returning. The pastor visited next, his face lined with shame. He admitted that he had believed the rumors, that he had thought I was slipping. "Forgive me, Margot," he said, his voice trembling. "I should have trusted the woman I have known for decades. Instead, I listened to their performance." He bowed his head, and for the first time since my husband's death, I felt the weight of isolation lift. Betrayal wounds deepest when it comes from blood, but solidarity heals fastest when it comes from those you least expect. Soon, even strangers approached me. At the market, women who had once avoided my eyes now leaned in close, whispering, "We heard the recording. What they said about you, it's unforgivable." Men who had once nodded politely now shook my hand, firmly muttering, "Justice will come. Don't you doubt it." And everywhere I went, I felt the shift like a tide turning. My son and his wife, once so smug in their control, could no longer walk down the street without hearing the hiss of gossip. Their laughter at my expense had become their curse. I could see it in their faces. My son's shoulders hunched lower each day, his eyes darting when neighbors greeted him coolly. My daughter-in-law's beauty no longer shone. It curdled into bitterness as invitations to gatherings dried up as whispers followed her into stores. They had wanted to bury me in shame, but now they drowned in it themselves. The humiliation they had designed for me had become their inheritance. And yet, even as justice blossomed around me, I knew the battle was not mine alone. I tell you this now because betrayal like this is not a private wound. It infects the air. It spreads like fire. My neighbors, my pastor, my friends, each of them became witnesses, not only to what was done to me, but to the truth of what happens when greed turns family into enemies. I had been one woman fighting in silence. Now I was no longer alone. Their voices carried mine, amplifying it, ensuring that the story could never again be twisted to silence me. I want to ask you something. If you were in my place, if the very people you gave life to turned their knives against you, would you stay silent? Would you let them write the ending of your story? Or would you fight until the truth burned so brightly it set the world ablaze? Comment 1 if you believe betrayal can never stay hidden. Hit like if you know that when the truth comes, it comes like fire consuming everything in its path. Because that is what happened to them. Their plan was ash now scattered by the very community they thought would believe them. And me, I stood taller, no longer bowed by grief, but lifted by dignity. The fire had spread, but for once it was not destroying me. It was cleansing the lies. Justice does not always arrive in a courtroom with a gavel striking wood. Sometimes it creeps in quietly like dawn, breaking after a night too long. In the weeks that followed the showdown, I watched the scales begin to balance, not through revenge of my own hands, but through the natural weight of truth, pressing down on those who had betrayed me. My son and his wife, once so proud, so certain of their victory, could no longer hold their heads high. The whispers in town turned to pointed stares, then to doors quietly closed in their faces. Invitations disappeared, business partners withdrew, friends slipped away. The very community they had hoped to impress now treated them like pariahs, their names spoken with disgust. They had wanted to strip me of dignity, but it was their dignity that crumbled, piece by piece, every time someone crossed the street to avoid them. The legal consequences soon followed. The lawyer who had witnessed the recordings, the forged signatures, and the original documents wasted no time in reporting the evidence. An investigation was opened slow and deliberate, but relentless. They were questioned about the forgeries, about their attempt to file false petitions of incompetence. I heard later that my daughter-in-law broke down in tears during questioning, insisting she had been manipulated, while my son sat stone-faced, his silence more damning than any confession. Forgery is not a small crime. Conspiracy is not easily forgiven. And though the process was still unfolding, the shadow of the law now followed them everywhere they went. As for me, I found something I thought had been buried with my husband, peace. Not perfect peace, for betrayal leaves scars that never truly fade, but a quiet strength that hummed in my chest. Each morning I opened the curtains to let the light in. The house, once filled with whispers and threats, felt like mine again. I walked through the rooms, touching the furniture, the photographs, the small objects of a life built together, and I whispered, "We protected this love. We protected it." The weight of fear had lifted, replaced by the solidity of proof, the comfort of community, the echo of my husband's foresight guiding me still. But make no mistake, the wounds remain. Sometimes I wake at night hearing echoes of their voices, their laughter as they plotted my erasure. Sometimes I look at the family photographs and wonder when exactly the boy I raised, the son I loved, began to see me not as a mother, but as an obstacle. That pain will never fully leave me. Yet even so, I choose not to be defined by it. I choose to stand taller, to live, to honor the love that built this home, rather than the betrayal that tried to tear it apart. The aftermath is not only theirs, it is mine as well. I learned that dignity is not something given by others. It is something you reclaim with your own hands, even if those hands tremble. I learned that silence is the soil in which betrayal grows, and that breaking it is the first act of justice. I learned that love, real love, leaves behind more than grief. It leaves behind strength strong enough to face storms alone. So when people stop me in the market now, their voices hushed but kind, saying, "We admire you for standing up," I only smile. Because the truth is, I did not stand alone. My husband's foresight, Elena's wisdom, Joseph's loyalty, the eyes of the community, they stood with me. And now, even as the law prepares its own verdict, the verdict that matters most has already been delivered. They are disgraced. I am free. They wanted to bury me in shame. Instead, they buried themselves. The storm has passed, though the memory of it lingers. When I wake now, the house no longer feels like a battlefield. The walls that once echoed with whispers of betrayal now hold only the hum of silence, and that silence is no longer oppressive. It is sacred. Each creak of the floorboards reminds me of the man I loved, not the lies my family spun. Each ray of sunlight spilling through the curtains feels less like a spotlight on my shame and more like a blessing on my survival. I walk through the rooms, slowly touching the furniture, the photographs, the keepsakes of a life lived fully. Once I feared these objects would be stripped away, that my name would vanish from deeds and papers as though I had never existed. But now each one feels anchored again, safe. They belong not just to me, but to the love my husband and I built, the sacrifices we made, the years of laughter and struggle that no petition, no forged document, no cruel whisper could ever erase. The garden has become my sanctuary. On quiet mornings, I kneel among the roses, pruning, watering, letting the earth ground me. The soil clings to my fingers, reminding me that dignity, like flowers, must sometimes be fought for, tended, protected. One spring afternoon, I caught myself humming a sound I had not made since before my husband's illness. At first it startled me, the simple spark of joy. Then I let it flow. Because joy is not betrayal. Living is not betrayal. If he were here, I know he would tell me, bloom again, Margot. Even in my absence, bloom. And so I do. There are scars, of course. Some nights I still hear their voices sharp and cruel, telling me I am confused, that I will be erased. But then I remember the day in the lawyer's office, the look on their faces as their own words betrayed them. I remember the neighbors standing by me, the pastor bowing his head in shame for doubting me, Elena's fierce voice reminding me I was not helpless. Those memories push the shadows back. They remind me that while betrayal may wound, truth endures, and dignity once reclaimed cannot be stolen again. Now, when I think back to the funeral, to the word hurled at me in Russian, like a curse, starucha, pathetic old woman, I feel no shame, because I know what they will never understand. You cannot erase love, built over decades. You cannot forge 30 years of devotion. You cannot silence the truth of a life lived with integrity. Those are treasures not written on paper, but carved into time, and they are mine, untouchable. So I leave you with this, you who listen to my story. If you ever find yourself silenced, doubted, dismissed, remember that the truth has a way of surviving. Betrayal may be loud, but it always stumbles on its own arrogance. Comment 1. If you believe dignity is worth fighting for no matter the cost. Hit like if you know betrayal always meets its justice. Do not let the world convince you that your voice is too small, too fragile, too broken. Because sometimes the loudest voice in the room is not the one speaking now, but the truth. The dead leave behind, guiding you, protecting you, whispering in your ear. Fight, endure, rise. They tried to bury me in shame, but I rose in dignity. And I ask you, if it were you, if your own family tried to erase your worth at the very moment you were grieving, would you fight back? Would you let your voice rise even when the world tried to push it down? Because in the end, I was not just a widow. I was not just a target. I was Margot Ivanov, and I survived.